The sea was calm that morning. Calm in a way that made the world itself seem indifferent to human suffering. A U.S. Navy transport vessel, gray and rusted with Pacific salt, cut through the still waters toward Oahu. On its deck stood 50 Japanese women, nurses, clerks, and auxiliaries once loyal to the empire. Now, stripped of rank and country, they clung to the railings as the island came into view. Hawaii, a place they'd been taught to hate. The spearhead of the enemy. They had not slept. For 3 days they'd been told nothing. Their hands still bore the stains of iodine, their uniforms stiff with salt and fear. A Marine sergeant barked an order. The women flinched. Even the smallest sound. The slam of a metal hatch, the scrape of boots on deck, carried the weight of all they imagined America to be. They'd heard stories whispered during the war. Prisoners used for experiments, women humiliated before crowds. The propaganda had been thick as smoke. Now that smoke was lifting. As the transport approached the pier, they saw figures waiting. U.S. Army nurses in khaki, a few medics, a chaplain with a small wooden cross. No jeers, no cameras, no shouting. Just silence and discipline. The women hesitated to step down the gangway, expecting a trick. But the guards didn't push them. One simply said, "Single file, please," in careful, accented Japanese. The sound of politeness startled them more than anger ever could. They were taken by truck to a processing center on the outskirts of Honolulu. A low wooden compound surrounded not by barbed wire, but chain-link fences hung with Red Cross banners. The air smelled of disinfectant and hibiscus. It was the first pleasant smell many had known in years. Inside, American clerks typed names they couldn't pronounce. Medical staff recorded temperatures and vaccination marks. Then came the order that froze every woman where she stood. Delousing procedure, showers, 2 at a time. A murmur swept through the group. Fear, disbelief, memory. The youngest, barely 18, whispered, "Gas chambers." Another nodded, eyes wide. They had heard what happened to prisoners in Europe, had seen photographs smuggled through the black market after Germany's fall. To be told to undress was to face annihilation. They entered the barracks one by one. Steam curled under the door. The floor was clean. Too clean. Each woman clutched her ragged uniform as if it were armor. Then something strange. A voice. Gentle. Calm. An American nurse, her sleeves rolled up, motioned to a wooden bench. "Leave your clothes there," she said softly. "We will burn the lice. You'll get new ones soon." Her words were translated. Hesitant but clear, the nurse's eyes did not hold cruelty, only exhaustion. The kind born of years spent mending the broken. Still, the prisoners trembled. When the first stream of hot water burst from the pipe, one woman screamed, high and sharp, echoing off the concrete. But it was water. Only water. Hot, clean, falling over skin that hadn't felt warmth in months. The cry turned to a gasp, then silence. A few began to wash. Others wept, soap in their hands, unable to believe. In the next room, the nurses laid out towels, thick, white, folded with military precision. Beside them, small Red Cross parcels, stamped with blue ink and sealed in wax paper. Inside each were items the women had never seen before. Toothbrushes, toothpaste, sanitary cloths, and, most astonishing of all, tiny glass bottles of perfume. One nurse smiled and handed a bottle to a trembling prisoner. "From the Red Cross," she said. "For you?" The woman did not move. Perfume, for the defeated. It made no sense. Her fingers closed around the glass like it was a relic. When she uncorked it, a scent rose into the damp air, faint, floral, foreign. not the sweetness of victory, but the gentleness of forgiveness. Outside, the other prisoners waited. The first to emerge from the showers were unrecognizable. Hair washed, faces clean, eyes red from crying. Their American guards stood at attention, rifles lowered. The nurses said nothing. They simply nodded one by one as if to say, "It's over. You are safe." That night, as the women lay on cots in the barracks, the faint scent of perfume lingered. It mixed with the salt of their tears, the starch of new blankets, the hum of electric lights that stayed on through the dark. They did not speak. Each stared at the ceiling, seeing the same strange truth form in silence. The enemy had shown them mercy, and mercy, they realized, was harder to bear than hatred. One nurse, sitting by the door, hummed softly. The same hymn she'd sung on the ship. A song about cleansing, about light. The women didn't know the words, but they understood the feeling. In another time, another place, they might have laughed together, or shared a meal, or spoken about families lost to the same war. But here, the language of compassion was enough. Hot water, clean towels, a bottle of perfume, symbols that said, "You are still human." Outside, the island night pressed against the walls. Palm leaves rustled. The ocean whispered far beyond the fence. It was the sound of the world moving on. Slow, steady, unfeeling, yet alive. And in that small corner of captivity, dignity returned, one drop of perfume at a time. The women of the rising sun had once believed they would die before capture. Every school lesson, every wartime poster had whispered the same message. Surrender was shame. To fall into enemy hands, their instructors said, is to lose your honor, your soul, and your name. But here, in a Hawaiian barracks under the flag of their conquerors, they had lost none of those things. They were still alive. They still had names. And for the first time, they were being called by them. A clerk read the roster that morning, his English accented but steady. Miss Hayashi, Miss Kuroda, Miss Takamine. Each name was followed by a nod from a woman who barely recognized herself anymore. It was strange hearing Miss before her surname, a courtesy, not an order. In Japan, they had been soldiers of a sacred empire. Here they were simply women again. Hayashi Yumi was the first to notice the small kindnesses. She was 26, a nurse from Nagoya, her hair cut short when she joined the Women's Volunteer Nursing Corps. During the siege of Saipan, she had treated soldiers burned so badly they begged for death. When the Americans landed, she'd hidden with the wounded in a cave until the flames found them. Captured, shamed, certain she would be killed, she had prepared herself for the worst. Yet now, standing barefoot on the barracks floor, a towel around her shoulders, she smelled like lavender. It was almost unbearable. Across from her sat Takamine, the youngest, just 17. She whispered, "It feels like a trick." Hayashi nodded, because she had thought the same. They had all seen what soldiers could do when the world turned to madness. But this was not madness. It was something harder to understand. Compassion without victory, discipline without cruelty. The guards were ordinary men, quiet, sunburned, polite. They addressed the prisoners with "ma'am" and "please," words that cracked through the silence like small explosions of decency. When meals were served, they stood back until the women had eaten. Some of the POWs refused the food, convinced it was poisoned. Others tasted cautiously, then hungrily. White bread, boiled eggs, butter. Real butter. Takamine cried while eating, not because it was good, but because it tasted like something that shouldn't have survived war. Outside, The Hawaiian wind carried the smell of the sea and sugarcane. For the women, the scent stirred memories of home, of open fields and rivers, of laughter before the world demanded obedience. They began to talk in whispers again, not about death or loyalty, but about things they'd buried. Family, love, childhood. Even laughter, tentative and cracked like glass, returned. But inside Yumi Hayashi's mind, another war raged. The invisible one between what she'd been taught and what she was seeing. The Americans are demons, her instructors had said. They kill, they desecrate, they take pleasure in shame. Yet the nurse who handed her the perfume had smiled like a sister. The chaplain who walked the compound in the evening had bowed to her before speaking, his hands always visible, his tone soft. And the guards, they never looked long, never lingered, never touched. Respectful, controlled, human. That word, human, became a quiet rebellion in her thoughts. It whispered to her at night, when the others slept. It asked questions she didn't know how to answer. Had the emperor lied? Had she lied to herself? That afternoon, the women were assigned small chores: folding blankets, sweeping floors, cleaning utensils. It wasn't forced labor, only structure. The Americans believed order calmed the mind. Yumi noticed how the nurses worked beside them, not above them. The Americans scrubbed floors too. They didn't command, they joined. Something shifted in her chest, not gratitude yet, but a loosening of the iron bands around her heart. Later, as the sun burned low over the Pacific, an American nurse named Clara sat on the steps of the barracks, unbuttoning the top of her uniform to let the air cool her neck. She offered Yumi a cigarette. Yumi hesitated, not out of fear, but disbelief. Clara smiled. It's okay. Peace tastes better when you share it. Neither woman understood the other's words perfectly, but tone filled the gaps. Yumi accepted. The smoke curled between them like a fragile bridge between worlds. That night, when the women lay down again, they didn't stare at the ceiling. They whispered. One asked what Hawaii meant. Another wondered if her mother was still alive in Nagoya. Someone laughed softly when she remembered how American soap foamed more than Japanese soap. Too soft for wartime, she said. Even in captivity, they were becoming people again. Then, as lights dimmed, the chaplain's voice carried faintly from outside the barracks. A prayer for peace, spoken not for Americans, but for all souls lost to war. The women listened. No one translated. They didn't need to. Inside that silence, something delicate began to grow. A kind of forgiveness that didn't yet have words, only warmth. As the night deepened, Yumi rolled over, clutching her towel like a blanket. The perfume still lingered faintly on her skin. She breathed it in, half in fear it would vanish by morning. But it didn't. It stayed, light and invisible. The scent of a truth she was not yet ready to speak. That even in defeat, she was still worthy of being clean. Outside, the Pacific wind brushed the barracks walls, moving through the wire fences like a sigh. The stars above Hawaii burned quietly, same stars that once shone above Nagoya. And for the first time since capture, Yumi Hayashi closed her eyes without seeing fire. But in the still hours before dawn, the scent still lingered. It wasn't just perfume anymore. It had soaked into the sheets, into her skin, into the corners of her memory where fear used to sleep. It was something foreign, yes, but gentle, clean. It unsettled her because it reminded her of another life. a life from before the uniforms, before the empire, before the nurses' corps and the red sun stitched on her shoulder. It reminded her of the girl she used to be, and that, somehow, was more frightening than the war had ever been. That morning, the routine returned. Wake up at first light. Fold your blanket. Report by name. Eat in silence. Perform assigned duties. Only now, something had shifted. Barely perceptible, like a tremor beneath the floorboards. The guards noticed first. The women no longer moved like shadows. They looked up when spoken to. Some even whispered "thank you" in broken English. In the mess hall, the youngest, Takamin, approached one of the American cooks and pointed at a small metal tin behind the counter. "What is?" she asked timidly. The cook blinked, then smiled, setting it gently in front of her. It was peanut butter. She dipped one finger in. Her eyes widened. Then she laughed. The room froze. It was the first time any of the women had laughed out loud since their arrival, and in that moment, the entire camp seemed to exhale. But outside the wire, the world had not forgotten the war. On the bulletin board near the medical tent, fresh clippings from Honolulu's Advertiser and Star Bulletin were pinned each morning. Surrender rumors intensify. Emperor may broadcast. Okinawa secured. Kamikaze attacks diminish. Europe rebuilding. Focus shifts to Pacific. None of the women were allowed to read these. But they saw the headlines. And they saw the nurses whisper about something big on the horizon. Yumi Hayashi sensed it too. Every kindness she received now carried weight. As if these Americans, once fierce and cold in her imagination, now acted out of something deeper than duty. Perhaps even guilt. That afternoon, she was pulled aside by Nurse Clara. The two of them stood beneath the laundry lines as white sheets flapped like sails above them. Clara looked tired. She rubbed her forehead and said slowly, "Would you speak to the others? Help us. Help them. Adjust." Yumi frowned. Clara tried again. "You help. Talk to other women. Calm." The request stunned her, not because of what was asked, but because of who was asking it. To be trusted, even a little, by the enemy. It stirred a warmth Yumi wasn't ready to name. She bowed stiffly. "I try." In the days that followed, Yumi became a quiet bridge between two languages, two shattered worlds. She translated instructions. She calmed fears. She explained, slowly and gently, that the water was not poisoned, that the guards would not enter the showers, that the meals were safe. At first, the other women watched her with suspicion. Was she collaborating? Was she broken? But then they saw what she carried in her coat pocket, a tiny bottle of perfume, barely a thimble's worth left. She didn't wear it. She didn't offer it. She only touched it when the world got too loud. And they understood. She had not forgotten the past. She had simply chosen to see the present. Then came the unexpected visit. A U.S. Army officer arrived at the barracks with a clipboard and a translator. He wore no weapon. His boots were clean. His hat sat low on his brow, shadowing a face that looked more like a teacher than a soldier. He called out names. One by one, the women stepped forward. Their records were reviewed. Questions asked. Were you ever trained in medicine? Do you speak any English? Do you wish to return to Japan or remain in U.S. custody until repatriation is arranged? The answers came slowly. Most said nothing at all. But Yumi, when asked, simply said, "I want peace." The officer looked at her, nodded once, and moved on. Later that evening, she found a note on her cot, folded neatly. Inside, volunteers needed for hospital laundry detail, request approved, non-combatant roles, compensation, books, reading lessons, Red Cross gifts. She stared at the paper. Books, lessons, gifts. The word compensation rang in her ears. It was the first time since capture that someone had implied her life could hold value beyond survival. That night, as stars bloomed across the Pacific sky, The barracks were quiet again, but not empty. The women lay still, each locked in her own fragile thoughts. Some wept softly into their pillows. Others lay with open eyes, staring at the wooden beams above. And a few, like Takamine, wrote in the margins of old shipping invoices with borrowed pencils, writing letters they could not send, letters to mothers, to sisters, to the girls they used to be. Yumi opened the perfume bottle again, this time not to smell it, but simply to remember. Remember the nurse who handed it to her with gentle hands. Remember the moment the shower had turned on and she realized she was still alive. Remember the strange, quiet truth that now lived inside her. The enemy had given her dignity back, and dignity did not smell like roses or incense. It smelled like hot water, like starch, like hope, like lavender. The mornings in the camp began to change. Not through orders or discipline, but through silence that no longer carried fear. The sound of boots, once sharp and mechanical, now blended with the splash of water and the rhythm of brushes sweeping the floors. The barracks had become a place of ritual, not punishment. Every morning before the sun rose, Yumi Hayashi walked to the outdoor basin where the nurses washed uniforms. The air was cool, heavy with dew and the scent of soap. Her hands, once used to dressing wounds and holding dying soldiers, now scrubbed cotton cloth until her fingers burned. Yet she didn't mind. The water was warm, and warmth, she realized, was its own kind of freedom. The American nurse Clara often joined her. She never spoke much, just hummed old songs in a soft alto voice. Yumi didn't know the words, but she followed the tune, echoing faintly under her breath. Two women from two nations that had burned each other's cities now stood side by side, their harmony rising above the clatter of buckets. Sometimes, Clara looked at Yumi and smiled, a small, tired curve of the mouth that held more truth than language ever could. That week, the sky above Oahu turned gray with summer storms. When rain came, it swept across the island like a curtain, sheets of water drumming against tin roofs, washing the dust from every path. The prisoners were ordered to stay inside the barracks. They sat by the open windows, watching the storm through the wire fences. Yumi watched the raindrops streak down the glass and thought of home, of her mother washing rice in the kitchen basin, humming the same folk song she used to hum when Yumi was a child. For the first time, the memory didn't sting. Beside her, Takamine whispered, "When I close my eyes, I forget where I am." Yumi turned to her. "And where are you?" The girl smiled faintly. "Somewhere without uniforms." That night, the chaplain returned. He came often now, unarmed and alone, walking the perimeter of the camp as the women listened from their bunks. He always stopped outside the barracks to offer prayer, not for soldiers, not for nations, but for those who carry burdens too heavy for war to name. The first time, the women ignored him. The second time, they listened. Now they waited. He began to speak softly, rain still dripping from the eaves. "In this place," he said, "water cleans not only the body, but also what cannot be seen." Yumi didn't understand every word, but she felt its weight. She thought of the showers, that terrifying moment when hot water first touched her skin. She realized now that the cleansing hadn't been physical. It had been something deeper, like the storm outside. Fierce, purifying, impossible to stop. Days passed. Then weeks. The war outside was ending faster than the news could travel. Word spread through whispers from the guards. The emperor might surrender. The women didn't believe it at first. Japan had promised eternal resistance. 100 million hearts beating as one. But something in the Americans' behavior changed. They no longer spoke of the enemy. They spoke of the end. When Clara entered the barracks that afternoon, she looked different, her shoulders relaxed, her eyes softer. She placed a folded newspaper on the table. "Tokyo bombed again," she said quietly. "Nagasaki." Yumi translated the word for the others. The silence that followed was not fear. It was something heavier. Realization. Some of the women wept. Others stared at the floor. One shouted prayers for her family in Kyushu. Clara stood there, wordless, the shame of victory written across her face. Yumi watched her, and something broke quietly inside her chest. Not hatred, not grief, but a deep, exhausted understanding. This was not the enemy. This was another soul carrying her own ghosts. Later that evening, Clara found Yumi sitting alone outside near the water trough where the nurses usually washed clothes. The sky was streaked with red, a sunset that looked too much like fire. "You okay?" Clara asked softly. Yumi nodded, though her hands trembled. "You're home," Clara said, searching for words. "Far away, Sorry." The phrase came out broken, but Yumi understood. She looked at Clara and saw tears at the corner of her eyes. "The war finished soon," Yumi said, the words clumsy but sincere. Clara looked at her for a long moment, then whispered, "Maybe for men. But for women, it takes longer." They sat together in silence, the last rays of sun slipping into the sea. That night, Yumi could not sleep. The perfume bottle sat beside her on the small wooden crate she used as a nightstand. She opened it and let a single drop fall onto her palm. The smell of lavender filled the air again. For the first time, she realized what it reminded her of. Not luxury, not foreign beauty, but her own humanity. The part of herself that war had buried under orders and obedience. It wasn't the scent of victory. It was the scent of survival. She closed her eyes and whispered a word she hadn't spoken since the war began. "Thank you." The wind outside shifted. The ocean murmured against the distant reef. A nurse's laughter carried faintly from another barracks, followed by the sound of rain beginning again. Soft, endless, cleansing, and in that rhythm, Yumi felt something sacred awaken inside her. Not forgiveness yet, but the possibility of it. As dawn broke, steam rose from the wet earth. The camp smelled of salt, soap, and rain. The women lined up for roll call, their faces calm. The guards saluted. The nurses smiled. For a moment, the world was silent. The kind of silence that feels like peace before the world remembers itself again. And when Yumi raised her eyes to the sky, she thought she saw the faintest shimmer of light beyond the clouds. It smelled again, of water, of wind, of home. On the third Sunday of August, the American nurse Clara brought a record player into the barracks. It was an old, portable unit. Dented corners, frayed wires, but still functional. She placed it carefully on a wooden crate, adjusted the needle, and without ceremony, let the music begin. The women froze. The melody that rose was nothing like the imperial marches they had drilled to, nor the mournful flutes of Shinto ritual. It was smooth, flowing, American. Jazz. Ella Fitzgerald's voice danced in the humid Hawaiian air, gentle and unbothered by the war that had scorched both nations. Yumi sat on the floor, hands in her lap, stunned. Across the room, one of the older women, Kayo, a clerk from Hiroshima, whispered, "They let us listen to beauty?" No one answered. But they all heard it. It wasn't just music. It was evidence. Proof that the Americans were not trying to break them. That night, the women asked Clara to play it again. She did, and the night after that, and the next. By the end of the week, Yumi found herself humming the first few bars in the laundry area, the song weaving through her fingers as she scrubbed sheets. One of the guards, an older corporal with kind eyes, walked by and stopped. "Good tune, huh?" he said gently. Yumi looked up, startled. He just smiled, tipped his helmet, and kept walking. But there were some things music couldn't erase. One morning, Takamine didn't come to roll call. A fever had taken her overnight. Something buried in her bones from days spent hiding in caves back on Saipan. The American nurses brought her to the infirmary and allowed Yumi to sit at her side. They gave her real medicine, morphine, a cooling cloth, fresh sheets. Yumi watched as Clara knelt and wiped the girl's forehead with the tenderness of a sister. There was no hesitation, no revulsion, only care. Takamine's eyes fluttered open once, and she whispered, "Mama." Then she closed them again. 2 days later, she died. They buried her in a small corner of the base, away from the barracks, beneath a plumeria tree. The chaplain read words in English. Yumi recited the Amida Sutra in Japanese. The nurses stood behind her, heads bowed. When the small wooden cross was placed in the soil, Clara stepped forward and tucked a single bar of soap beneath it. One of the small Red Cross parcels Takamine had been too young to understand when she arrived. Yumi wept, not for the war, not for the past, but for the kindness shown to a girl the world had no reason to remember. That evening, the perfume bottle stayed sealed. The scent didn't seem sacred anymore. It felt fragile. In the days that followed, something hardened among the women. Not resentment, not grief, something quieter. An ache for home, a longing that smelled like clean rice and tatami mats, and the sound of cicadas in late summer. Even with music, even with food, even with respect, they were still prisoners, still held behind wire, still watched, still unable to write letters, to know who had survived back home. They now knew the Americans could be kind. But they were also the same hands that dropped bombs over Tokyo, that turned Hiroshima into a furnace, that made Takamine cough blood at 17. No perfume could mask that. One night, Kayo stood by the fence and looked at the stars. She said, "We believed we were the sun, that we gave light, that we were eternal." Yumi stood beside her. "And now?" she asked. Kayo didn't answer, but the silence between them said enough. Then one morning, the sky split open with a cheer. From the officers' mess, a shout echoed. "It's over. They surrendered." Music blared. Flags rose. Somewhere beyond the fence, someone fired a celebratory shot into the air. The Japanese women stood in stunned silence. Some laughed bitterly, others fell to their knees. Yumi just stood still. The guards were quiet when they came to deliver the news officially. A short, well-dressed officer addressed the prisoners in clear Japanese. "The war has ended. Your emperor has spoken. Japan has surrendered unconditionally. You will be processed for repatriation. Those who wish to return will be sent home." No one moved. That evening, the record player was quiet. Clara entered the barracks slowly, carrying something in her hands. It wasn't a letter. It wasn't food. It was a mirror, metal-framed, clean. She held it out to Yumi. "For you?" she said. "To see who you are." Yumi stared at it for a long time. Then she took it, and for the first time in 4 years, she saw her face. Not as a uniform, not as a subject, not as a shameful survivor of capture, but as a woman. As someone who had lost and lived, who had been broken and washed clean. She brought the mirror back to her bunk and placed it beside the perfume bottle. Then she did something she hadn't done since the war began. She sat in silence and brushed her hair. Outside, the ocean breathed slowly beneath the moonlight. The guards no longer paced. The wire fences no longer hummed with tension. And the perfume? It had faded by now, but something deeper had remained. The part of her that knew she was still whole, even if her country wasn't. The news spread like wind through dry grass. Repatriation was coming. Ships would be assigned, names called, papers signed. The war was finished, the ink still drying on surrender documents in Tokyo Bay. The emperor had spoken. The sword had been sheathed. Now, the victors offered a way home. But for many in the barracks, the word home no longer had shape. Yumi Hayashi stood before a clipboard held by a young American lieutenant. He looked barely 20. His jaw was clenched, not in anger, but discomfort, like he didn't know how to look these women in the eyes. He pointed to a line of boxes. "Home country, Japan," he said. "Sign if return." Yumi stared at the page. Her name was typed at the top. Her past, printed in black ink. Rank, nurse first class. Location of capture, Saipan. She held the pencil, unmoving. The nurse Clara stood beside her, saying nothing. It should have been easy. Sign, go home. That's what survivors did. But where was home now? She had seen photographs smuggled in by a new guard. Hiroshima, Nagasaki, both gone like smoke. Her cousin had been in Hiroshima, a teacher. Her aunt, too. Maybe her old friend Haruka from nursing school. Maybe all of them were now ash. What if there was nothing left to return to? Kayo signed without hesitation. "I must see my father," she said, eyes hard. "He deserves to know I lived." A few of the younger women hesitated, then copied her lead. But others, silent, frozen, looked at the page like it was a verdict, not a permission slip. Later that night, the barracks echoed with questions whispered into the dark. What if they call us cowards? Will they shame us when we arrive? Can we ever be clean again, over there? No one answered, not even Yumi. The next morning, Clara returned to the barracks with a wooden box. She set it on the table and opened the lid slowly. Inside were photographs, torn, dog-eared, many black and white, others stained with seawater or time. She held one up. 2 girls in New York dresses, smiling under a cherry blossom tree. "Japanese Americans," she said. "Relocated during the war. Internment camps. Some of them stayed. Some left. Some never came back." Yumi leaned forward. She had heard rumors, even during the war. Whispers of Japanese living in America, being imprisoned by their own government. Traitors, they had called them. But here, Clara was saying something else. They were like you. And still, they found ways to live. That afternoon, a Red Cross volunteer entered the camp. A woman with streaks of gray in her hair and a ribbon pinned to her chest. She spoke fluent Japanese. "I'm from Maui," she said. "My parents came from Kyoto before the war. I was born American, but the war made me feel like an enemy." The women stared at her in silence. "You think you cannot live here," she said gently. "But I did. So can you. This land is wide. The people, not all are kind. But some are. And that is enough." One woman burst into tears. Another turned away. But Yumi remained still. That night, she walked alone near the wire fence. The moon cast shadows across the sandbags and metal posts. A warm breeze from the ocean carried the scent of wet leaves and distant sugarcane fields. She pressed her hand to the fence, feeling its coldness. This boundary, once a symbol of fear, now felt like a question. Inside was safety. Music, clean water, soap, mercy. Outside, unknown. Behind her, Clara stood. "You can stay," she said, voice low. Yumi turned. "As prisoner?" "No," Clara replied. "As refugee, maybe helper, war nurse. We ask the government. We try." Yumi stared at her. "You would do that for me?" Clara nodded. "Because you remind me of my sister, and because you remind me what this place is for." The next morning, the form was still on the table. Yumi picked up the pencil. She did not check the box for repatriation. She wrote in the margins, "Request to remain. Volunteer. Assist medical staff." translate, help others. She placed the form on Clara's desk. She did not wait for approval. The act itself was her answer. In the barracks, the women gathered their few belongings. Some wept as they folded uniforms they never wanted to wear again. Others whispered to their bunkmates, promises to write, to remember, to never forget what kindness felt like. Kayo hugged Yumi tightly. "You're brave," she whispered. Yumi shook her head. "No, I am still afraid. But I want to learn what comes after fear." They embraced. Then Kayo walked to the truck that would carry her to the port, never looking back. That night, the record player played one last time. Ella Fitzgerald again, her voice soft as memory, drifting into the humid darkness. Yumi stood near the window, watching the sea. She knew she would never see Japan again, but maybe she would find something here. Something not born of flags or borders. Something like purpose, something like healing, something like a name that meant more than survivor. As the song faded, she opened the perfume bottle one last time. There were only 2 drops left. She dabbed one on her wrist. The other she let fall onto the wooden floor. Then she placed the empty bottle on the windowsill, where the light of the moon caught it and made it shine. Outside, beyond the wire, the waves kept coming. Steady, endless, washing everything they touched. The bottle remained on the windowsill, glinting in the soft light of every sunrise. It was empty now, but no one dared move it. It stood like an altar, not to victory, not to grief, but to the moment something changed. To some, it was just glass. But to Yumi Hayashi, it was something sacred. Proof that mercy had a scent, and memory could live without pain. The women who had chosen to go home were gone now. Their bunks stripped. Their silence louder than their presence had ever been. Yumi missed them. At night, she would sometimes wake and reach across the narrow aisle for Takamine's laughter, for Kayo's late-night prayers, only to feel the cold emptiness of separation. The barracks echoed now. Clara called it peace, but Yumi knew better. It was afterward, and afterward is never quiet for long. With the others gone, Yumi's duties shifted. She now worked alongside American nurses at the base infirmary, sorting linen, organizing bandages, helping translate when Japanese civilians were brought in from outlying islands. Many of the staff still didn't know what to make of her. To them, she was both enemy and asset. Cautiously welcomed, politely tolerated, but not Clara. Clara treated her like a colleague, sometimes in private like a sister. One afternoon, while inventorying antiseptics in the supply tent, Clara held up a brown glass bottle and said, "Still smells like fear to me." Yumi looked at her. "I mean," Clara added, "this stuff, iodine, bleach, reminds me of nights in field hospitals, bombs overhead, men dying with dirt in their lungs." Yumi nodded slowly. "Yes," she said. "Same smell. Same war." They looked at each other. The silence between them was not uncomfortable. It was shared. It was knowing. Later that week, a new group arrived at the processing station. Not women this time, but young Japanese boys, barely in their teens. Former laborers from islands farther west, pulled from collapsing bunkers, their bodies thin, their eyes hollow. One had gangrene. Another wouldn't speak at all. Yumi was asked to help. She stood at the door as the children filed in. Most didn't even look up, but one, the smallest, paused when he saw her. His lips parted. He whispered, "Are you American?" She stepped forward and knelt. "No," she said in soft Japanese. "I am like you." He blinked. "But you smell like them." Yumi didn't know what to say. She glanced down, realized she'd been given one of the American nurses' uniforms that morning. Khaki. Pressed. Clean. She no longer looked like a prisoner. She looked like someone who had crossed over. That night, Yumi washed the uniform by hand, scrubbed it until the soap foamed thick on her wrists. Not because it was dirty, but because she felt something in her reflection she couldn't explain. The mirror showed a woman between two worlds, too Western for Japan, too Japanese for America, a nurse without a country, a survivor without a home. She wiped the glass clean and whispered, "Still me." Then she placed the mirror next to the perfume bottle on the sill. Time moved differently now. The war had ended, but its shadow still fell long across the island. American soldiers danced to radio jazz in the mess hall. Locals returned to work the fields. The nurses laughed again. Real laughter, full-bodied, no longer haunted. But Yumi remained in the in-between. Some evenings, she sat alone near the garden, where vegetables grew behind the barracks. She pulled weeds, trimmed leaves, watered tomato vines. She did this not because she was ordered to, but because she needed the silence. Because the soil did not care who had lost, only who stayed. One afternoon, Clara approached her with a letter. "From Tokyo," she said. Red Cross approval came through. Yumi opened it slowly. The pages were formal, cold, but buried within the lines was confirmation. She had been granted temporary residence under protected medical aid status. She was no longer a prisoner. She was now an official volunteer. Yumi stared at the page for a long time. Then she smiled, just barely. Clara placed a hand on her shoulder. "You earned this." Yumi shook her head. "I survived this." They said nothing more. That night, she took the empty perfume bottle from the windowsill and wrapped it in a handkerchief. She placed it inside a small wooden box, the same one the Red Cross had once filled with soap and gauze. She wasn't throwing it away. She was preserving it, like a relic from a sacred fire. In the infirmary the next morning, she returned to the boy who had asked her if she was American. His fever had broken. She sat beside his cot and offered him a warm cloth and a cup of barley tea. He drank it quietly. Then he looked at her and said, "Do you think we'll go home?" Yumi didn't answer right away. She looked past him, toward the window where light streamed in soft as breath. Then she said, "Sometimes we don't go back. Sometimes we build a new place. Not a home yet, but a start." The boy nodded. And for the first time since arriving, he smiled. The sun rose again, not with triumph, not with mourning, just with light. Steady, soft, enough to see what remained. The banyan tree stood just beyond the medical tent, its thick roots spilling over the earth like veins from the past, anchoring the ground in memory. No one planted it. No one owned it. It had simply always been there. Long before the war, long before barbed wire and boots and grief, Yumi Hayashi began spending her evenings beneath it. She brought no books, no pen, no prayer beads, only herself. Some days she sat in silence. Other times she spoke aloud. Soft fragments of memory, questions she knew the tree would never answer. It was a place to feel without being seen. One evening, as twilight sank gently into the hills, Clara joined her. They sat together on a wooden bench made from salvaged cargo crates, their uniforms wrinkled from long shifts. Neither spoke for a while. The air smelled of hibiscus and disinfectant, a strange blend of healing and beauty. Then Clara broke the quiet. "You know," she said, "I used to think mercy was something we gave." Yumi turned to her. "And now?" Clara rubbed her palms together. "Now I think mercy is something we share, or it doesn't mean anything." That same week, a U.S. military photographer arrived at the camp. Headquarters wanted documentation, something to show reconstruction efforts, post-war cooperation, rehabilitation of civilian prisoners. The words made Yumi feel like an exhibit. But Clara squeezed her hand and said, "They don't know what you've been, only what you are now." The photographer asked for a group shot. Yumi stood in the back row, her hands folded neatly, her hair pulled into a bun. Next to her, the boy from Saipan, now stronger, his bandages removed, grinned shyly. The shutter clicked. The flash startled no one. The war had already blinded them long ago. Later, the photographer approached Yumi and asked if he could take one more picture. Not for publication, he said, lowering his voice. Just for the record, for remembrance. He pointed to the perfume bottle, now resting on Clara's desk in the infirmary. Someone said it mattered. Yumi looked at him, then nodded. The bottle was placed on a clean cloth. Sunlight streamed through the open flap of the tent, catching the glass and making it glow gold. Click. 1 second. One flash. A single bottle that had survived the war without ever being shattered. That night, Clara handed Yumi a folded envelope. This came through the Red Cross relay. It's from someone in Nagoya. Yumi's fingers trembled as she opened it. It was a letter. From her mother, alive. She read slowly, mouth moving silently over the words. Her mother was living in a refugee hostel. Her home had been lost in the firebombing. Her youngest brother had not returned. But she was alive, and she knew Yumi had survived. The letter ended with only one sentence. I lit incense for you every night, even when they said you were dead. Yumi pressed the paper to her chest, and for the first time since the war had ended, she wept without hiding. The next morning, she walked barefoot to the banyan tree. She carried no bag, no letter, no uniform, only a small bowl of water. She poured it at the base of the roots. Let it sink into the earth. An offering, not of religion, but of remembrance. For Takamin, for Kao, for the girls who would never find their way home. Then she whispered, I will carry them, not as ghosts, but as seeds. Weeks passed. The camp changed. Barbed wire came down. Trucks stopped arriving. The guards were reassigned. The infirmary no longer overflowed. Yumi remained, not as a nurse, not as a prisoner, as something else. She was given a new title, Civilian Aid Liaison. It meant little to most, but to her, it meant witness. It meant she was no longer a shadow. She began keeping records, translating for new arrivals, writing letters to distant provinces for those who couldn't spell. She stitched uniforms for the children, taught hygiene to girls from devastated villages, helped Clara build a new supplies ledger in both languages. The Americans came to trust her name. The Japanese came to trust her face. And in between them, she stood, like the banyan tree, roots in two worlds. One afternoon, a local Hawaiian woman approached her in the infirmary courtyard. She wore a faded dress and held a small bundle wrapped in linen. I heard about you, she said, about your perfume story. Yumi tilted her head, curious. The woman smiled. My grandmother used to make oils, lilikoi, plumeria, even ginger. I don't have much. But this is yours. She handed over the bundle. Inside, a small corked vial. Not lavender this time. Jasmine. Delicate. Bright. The kind that blooms only after dusk. Yumi held it up to her nose and inhaled. It was not the scent of survival. It was the scent of beginning. That evening, she placed the new bottle beside the old one on the windowsill. 2 bottles, 2 lives. One remembered, one still blooming. And beneath the quiet hum of the island wind, she whispered, I was not defeated, I was remade. By the time the last American truck rolled out of the processing station, the sun had begun its slow descent behind the green hills of Oahu. The chain-link fences stood open now, unguarded, swaying faintly in the trade winds like empty gates. There were no more prisoners here, no more barbed wire, only remnants. Faint outlines in the grass where tents once stood, darkened footprints on concrete floors, and names carved with fingernails into wooden bunk beams. Yumi Hayashi stood in the center of the empty compound and listened. There were birds now, and wind through palm leaves, and the clatter of distant carts from the local markets. But what struck her most was the sound of her own breath, steady, present, alive. She had thought the war would end in fire. Instead, it ended in stillness. For months she had stayed after the repatriations. Not out of duty, not even out of loyalty, but because leaving meant discarding the only place where her soul had begun to mend. And because something inside her whispered that healing was not a return, but a planting. Clara had left first, transferred to the Philippines with a medical relief unit. They said goodbye beneath the banyan tree, arms wrapped tightly, no words spoken. The kind of farewell only shared between women who had wept in front of each other. Clara left Yumi a letter. You gave mercy shape, not a flag, not a doctrine, a face, yours. Yumi folded it carefully and placed it between the 2 perfume bottles on the sill. 1 lavender, 1 jasmine, 2 limes. With the base dissolved, Yumi found herself working in the nearby town of Wahiawa. The Red Cross helped place her in a civilian relief office. Simple work. Filing forms, escorting displaced civilians, translating for families torn apart by war. She wore a borrowed blouse and a donated skirt. No rank, no insignia, just her name. But names had power. In Tokyo, Hayashi Yumi might still be recorded as Horio, prisoner. In some village records, she might be marked Fujo Najose, an unclean woman. Here, in this humid corner of the Pacific, she was Miss Hayashi, and for the first time, that was enough. One afternoon, an old Japanese man entered the relief center, leaning heavily on a cane made from driftwood. His face was creased by salt and age. He had worked on a sugar plantation before the war, imprisoned during internment, and now sought aid to reunite with family in Maui. When he saw Yumi, he stared for a long moment. Then he bowed low. I saw your face, he said, in the newspaper, the camp photograph. Yumi felt her hands go still. You smiled, he said, but not with your mouth, with your eyes. My granddaughter said it looked like peace. Yumi didn't know what to say, so she bowed, lower than him, and when he left, she sat alone for a long time, staring out the window at the banyan leaves swaying in the distance. At the edge of town stood a small Buddhist shrine, built by immigrants decades before Pearl Harbor. It had survived the war. Though some of its tiles were cracked, its bell rusted with salt. Yumi visited it often now, not for ritual, but for silence. There she met a woman named Anela, Hawaiian Japanese, born on the island, fluent in both tongues. Anela taught local children how to plant taro. She told stories of the old gods and the new gods, and how all of them whispered in the same wind, if you listened long enough. One morning, as they sat on woven mats beneath the shrine's overhang, Anela asked, "What name do you carry now?" Yumi frowned. "I don't understand." Anela smiled. "The name before the war was your family's. The one during the war belonged to the empire. But here, what name does your spirit carry?" Yumi looked down at her palms. Hands once bloodied in jungle hospitals. Hands that shook when she first undressed in front of enemy nurses. Hands that now planted herbs beside Anela's garden. "I don't know," she whispered. Anela leaned forward and gently placed a flower behind Yumi's ear. "Then you are still becoming." She kept working, kept helping, kept listening. The world outside the island roared on, treaties signed, borders redrawn, armies restructured. But here, each day unfolded quietly, like rice paper unrolling. One morning, a telegram arrived at the relief center. Clara Henderson, killed in medical transport crash. Philippines, remains identified. Personal effects returned to Red Cross. Yumi read the words 3 times before her vision blurred. Later that week, a parcel arrived at her door. Inside, Clara's dog tag, a photograph of the 2 of them beneath the banyan tree, and a note written on an old infirmary form. "If anything happens, let her keep the jasmine bottle. She knows what it means. Yumi held the bottle tightly that night, her tears silent. Then she rose, walked to the ocean's edge, and scattered a few drops of jasmine oil onto the waves. "Good night," she whispered. The sea shimmered under the moonlight, as if the stars themselves had fallen to the water. She stood there barefoot, wind in her hair, salt on her skin. She was not prisoner, not soldier, not lost. Only a name, unchained. In the years that followed, few on the island remembered the camp. The fences rusted. The barracks collapsed into termites and rain. Grass swallowed the paths where guards once marched. Only the banyan tree remained, its thick roots growing deeper, as if pulling memory down into the soil so it could rest. But one woman remembered everything. Yumi Hayashi still lived nearby, in a small house with paper walls and a tin roof that clanged in storms. She kept her garden neat, plumeria, ginger, green onions in neat rows. Her neighbors knew her simply as the quiet woman who walked barefoot at dusk, who lit incense at the edge of the sea and whispered to no one. She never married, never left, not because she was afraid, but because this place had become something her homeland never gave her. A place where mercy had bloomed like a weed in war's crater, where she had been given hot water when she expected gas, where strangers had handed her perfume instead of a rifle. She had been remade here, and she would not uproot what had finally grown from the ashes. In her home, a small wooden shelf sat beside the window. It held very little. The old mirror from the infirmary, a faded Red Cross card, Clara's dog tag, the lavender bottle, still empty, the jasmine bottle, nearly so, and the photograph, yellowing now, of her and Clara beneath the banyan tree. Every morning, she dusted it carefully. Then, with hands that still remembered how to tend wounds, she would place one drop, just one, of jasmine on her wrist. It was the last of it. But she never let it run out, because every time she lifted that scent to her nose, she remembered not the war, but what survived it. Once a year, a local school brought its students to learn about the history of the island. The teacher, a kind woman named Lehua, always asked Yumi to speak. She never forced her, only invited, and every year Yumi said yes. The children sat cross-legged beneath the banyan tree, notebooks in hand, their eyes wide and curious. They did not know about internment. They did not know about Saipan, or what it meant to be captured, or what fear looked like in a shower room. Yumi did not tell them everything. She told them only what mattered. "I came here in chains," she would say, "but the first thing they gave me was warm water, then soap, then a towel, then perfume." They always looked confused at that. "Why?" one child asked. "Weren't you the enemy?" Yumi smiled. "Yes," she said, "but someone decided not to treat me like one." One year, a boy brought her a drawing, crayon on lined paper, a tree, a woman, 2 bottles. He had written at the bottom, "You are like the banyan. You give shade." She wept that night, quietly, beside the jasmine bottle. One autumn, news came from Japan. Her younger cousin had found her name in an old U.S. camp archive. He was alive. He had children. He wished to visit. He arrived that spring, gray-haired, soft-spoken, wearing a suit too heavy for island heat. They sat together beneath the banyan, drinking barley tea. He listened as she told him the story. Not all of it, but enough. He nodded often, never interrupting. When she showed him the bottles, he didn't laugh. He wept. "You were stronger than any soldier," he said. Yumi looked out at the waves. "No," she replied. "I was simply lucky enough to be seen as human." On the morning of her 78th birthday, Yumi rose early. She walked barefoot to the edge of the water. The wind was warm. The air smelled of sea salt and distant blossoms. In her hand was the jasmine bottle, now nearly dry. She uncorked it, and with steady fingers, let the final drop fall into the sand. Then she turned and faced the rising sun. It was not dramatic. It was not symbolic. It was simply her life, and it was whole. That night, she lit incense at the banyan tree, whispered the names of the girls from the barracks, names no one else remembered, names she refused to let vanish. Then she returned home, placed the empty bottle beside the lavender one. 2 bottles. No scent, but full of memory. She lay down to sleep, the window open, the night warm and kind. And as the wind moved through the trees, it carried no bitterness, only the faint echo of water. And jasmine, in the old stories, when the war spirits left the earth, they followed the rivers and vanished into the mountains, taking their noise with them. But the women stayed behind, and from their silence, trees grew. The banyan does not ask where the fire came from. It only spreads its roots, and when the wind blows across its leaves, the scent is not of ash, but of something small, something sacred, that survived.